The street looked peaceful, almost like something from a picture book. Trees lined the sidewalks, their branches swaying gently whenever the wind passed. Houses stood neatly side by side, each one with trimmed lawns and cars parked in their driveways. Children sometimes rode their bikes here, their laughter echoing down the road, while parents waved at one another from porches. On the surface, everything seemed perfect, quiet, and ordinary. But beneath the calm, the neighborhood carried something else too. It was a place where people noticed everything, where curtains moved just enough for eyes to peek through, and where whispers carried faster than greetings. Some neighbors were kind and warm, always ready to offer help. Others lived with suspicion tucked tightly in their hearts, quick to judge, quicker to assume. Among the rows of houses lived families from different walks of life. Some had been there for decades, their roots deep in the soil of the community. Others had only recently moved in, bringing with them different customs, different rhythms, and sometimes, different appearances that did not always match the narrow expectations of the longtime residents. This unspoken tension lived quietly under the surface, showing itself in the way some people smiled politely but never truly spoke, or the way others locked their doors earlier when they saw someone they didn't fully trust. It was not an unfriendly place, but it was not always welcoming either. People greeted one another out of habit, not always out of care. Most kept to themselves, focusing on their own lives, their own homes, their own families. But even in silence, there was always someone watching. A car parked too long, a stranger walking by, even a dog barking at the wrong time, all of it became subjects for talk. On evenings, the street often grew very still. Families sat inside with their televisions on, the soft glow of screens flickering through their windows. Outside, the road grew empty, quiet enough that the smallest sound could draw attention. A gate creaking, footsteps on the pavement, or the faint tapping of someone working in their yard could make curtains lift as curious neighbors tried to see what was going on. Among the houses stood one painted a soft cream color, with a small porch and flower pots lined neatly along the edge. It belonged to a man who lived alone, someone who kept to himself but always nodded politely when he crossed paths with others. He was hardworking, careful, and proud of his home. He did not cause trouble, and yet, for some, his presence was never fully accepted. Not because of anything he did, but simply because of who he was. This was the kind of neighborhood where people's assumptions often spoke louder than the truth. Some neighbors carried kindness in their glances, while others carried suspicion in every stare. It was a place where differences stood out more than similarities, and where the smallest action could spark questions, even when nothing was wrong. The air of the neighborhood that night carried that same mix of calm and watchfulness. Lights glowed warmly in windows, crickets chirped softly in the distance, and the hum of televisions drifted through thin walls. Nothing seemed unusual. But in a place where watching was a habit, even the most ordinary action could draw attention. And sometimes, that attention turned into misunderstanding. As the night settled deeper, the cream-colored house with its neat porch became the center of quiet observation. A man stood outside working with some cables, minding his own business. To him, it was nothing unusual, just an evening task, something small to fix before going to bed. But to certain eyes watching from across the street, it did not look ordinary. It looked suspicious. This was the neighborhood, calm on the outside but quick to judge beneath the surface. A place where one person's ordinary life could become another person's cause for alarm. And it was here, on this quiet street, under the glow of porch lights and the gaze of watchful eyes, that a story would begin. One that would turn a peaceful evening into a scene of flashing lights, police questions, and lessons no one would forget. The man who lived in the cream-colored house was not someone who drew much attention. He lived a steady, quiet life. Every morning he left for work in clean but simple clothes, carrying his bag with him, and every evening he returned, often tired but still calm. He nodded at neighbors when they passed, held the door open for others when he saw them, and sometimes waved to the kids riding bikes. He was not loud, not troublesome, not the type to start arguments. He believed in minding his own business and expected the same in return. Technology was something he understood well. He worked with computers for a living, and at home he often spent time fixing gadgets, checking wires, and keeping things in order. His Wi-Fi in particular was something he paid attention to. Like many people, he relied on it for almost everything. Emails, work, calls, streaming, even helping families stay connected. When it failed, he took it upon himself to troubleshoot. That evening, the Wi-Fi had been unstable. Pages loaded slowly, the signal kept dropping, and his frustration grew. Instead of calling the company and waiting endlessly on the phone, he decided to fix it himself. He stepped outside with a small toolbox, crouched near the side of his house, and began adjusting the router connections that ran along the wall. To him, it was nothing unusual. He had done it before. The process was simple. Check the cables, restart the router, tighten the lines, and see if the signal improved. He worked with quiet focus, his hands moving confidently, his brow furrowed as he concentrated. The faint glow from his porch light fell across his face, and the cool evening breeze brushed against his shoulders. But in a neighborhood like his, every movement was noticed. Curtains shifted across the street. A neighbor walking her dog slowed down, her eyes narrowing slightly as she saw him crouched by the cables. Most people would have simply thought he's fixing something and moved on. But not everyone saw it that way. The man did not notice. He was used to being watched sometimes, but he had learned to ignore it. He told himself that as long as he lived honestly and caused no harm, there was nothing to worry about. Tonight, he was only focused on getting his Wi-Fi to work again. He checked the wires, muttering softly under his breath, and tested the connection with his phone. The signal flickered in and out, and he sighed, moving back to the router. Inside his house, the television screen glowed, paused halfway through a movie he had been watching. A mug of tea sat cooling on the table, forgotten. All he wanted was a quiet evening, a small problem solved, and a normal night's rest. But outside, unseen to him, assumptions were being built, layer by layer. From the corner window of a house across the street, a woman named Karen watched. She had noticed him before, but rarely with friendliness. Where others saw a hard-working neighbor, she saw someone who did not belong. Her eyes lingered on the color of his skin, on the fact that he often kept to himself, and she chose to fill the blanks of her own ignorance with suspicion. Now, seeing him crouched near wires, tools in hand, she told herself it was strange. She did not ask, she did not wave or call out to him. Instead, she convinced herself that he was tampering with lines, maybe even stealing service. Her imagination ran faster than the truth, and fear mixed with prejudice until it felt real to her. Meanwhile, the man wiped his hands on a cloth, finally satisfied that the cables were secure. He checked his phone again, relieved to see the signal stronger this time. A small smile touched his face. It was nothing big, but to him, it was victory enough for the evening. He began gathering his tools, humming softly as he prepared to go back inside. He did not know that, at that very moment, a phone was being lifted inside the house across the street. Karen dialed 3 numbers, 911, and began reporting him as a suspicious stranger outside a home. She spoke quickly, with urgency, describing him in detail, twisting the picture into one of danger instead of ordinary life. The man had no idea what was coming. To him, it was just another small problem solved. To her, it was an emergency. And soon, the flashing lights of police cars would interrupt the quiet street, drawn not by crime but by assumption. The man had only wanted to change his Wi-Fi. But in a neighborhood where not everyone saw fairly, that small action was enough to trigger something much larger. Something that would test the truth, expose prejudice, and leave the whole street talking long after the night was over. Karen stood at her window, the curtain pulled just enough for her to see the cream-colored house across the street. She often watched her neighbors like this, not out of friendliness but out of habit. To her, the street was not just a place to live, it was something she needed to monitor, to control in her own way. She believed she was keeping the neighborhood safe, though in truth, it was her suspicion, not her care, that guided her. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted the man crouched near the side of his house, wires spread out beside him, tools glinting under the porch light. He was focused, adjusting cables with practiced hands, occasionally glancing at his phone to check the signal. To anyone else, it would have been obvious, he was fixing his internet. But Karen did not see it that way. Her mind began to twist the scene. Why is he outside so late? Why is he touching those wires? The questions filled her head like whispers, each one sharper than the last. She ignored the obvious truth, that it was his house, his tools, his equipment. Instead, she convinced herself that something was wrong. Karen had always carried an unease around him. She never admitted it openly, but she judged him the moment he moved into the neighborhood. She told herself it wasn't prejudice, only being careful. But the truth was that his skin color, his quiet way of living, his independence, all of it unsettled her. She wanted to believe she was protecting her community, but deep inside, it was fear mixed with bias that fueled her suspicion. As she watched, her imagination began to paint darker pictures. She convinced herself he was tampering with cables that didn't belong to him, maybe even trying to steal service from other homes. The more she watched, the more certain she became, not because of evidence, but because her mind refused to consider any other possibility. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Something's not right," she muttered under her breath, though no one was there to hear her. Her heart began to race, not with danger but with the thrill of taking action. She felt important, like she was the one responsible for keeping order. Karen reached for her phone. She hesitated for only a second before dialing the numbers she had memorized since childhood. 911. Her fingers moved quickly, and soon the operator's calm voice answered, asking for the nature of her emergency. Karen's tone grew sharp, filled with urgency. "There's a suspicious man outside a house on my street," she said quickly. "He's messing with wires, looks like he's trying to break into something. I don't think he belongs here." The words poured out easily, but they were shaped by assumption, not truth. She didn't mention that it was his home. She didn't mention that she had never actually seen him cause harm. Instead, she painted him as a stranger, an intruder, someone dangerous. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher asked for details. Karen described his clothing, his skin color, his movements, each word adding weight to the picture she was creating. She spoke with certainty, as though she had caught a criminal in the act. And with every word, she pushed the truth further away. When the call ended, Karen let the curtain fall back into place. She stood by the window, her chest rising and falling quickly. In her mind, she had done something good. She told herself she had acted bravely, that she had possibly stopped a crime before it happened. She felt powerful, self-righteous, convinced she had protected her neighborhood. But outside, the man had no idea what was unfolding. He was still crouched by the cables, adjusting the last connection, his thoughts focused only on making sure the Wi-Fi would run smoothly. He was tired from the day's work and wanted nothing more than to finish quickly, go inside, and enjoy the peace of a normal evening. Karen's eyes flicked back toward the window. In the distance, she thought she saw a faint glow, the reflection of headlights turning onto the street. Her heart leapt with a strange satisfaction. Soon the police would arrive. Soon she would be proven right, or so she believed. What she didn't realize was that her call had set in motion something much larger than her suspicion. She had turned an ordinary moment into a crisis, built not on truth but on prejudice. And when the flashing lights filled the quiet neighborhood, it would not be the man at fault. It would be the fear and bias she had carried in her heart. The stage was set. The man worked calmly, unaware of what awaited him. The neighbors, behind closed doors, would soon hear the sirens. And Karen, standing in her window with satisfaction in her eyes, thought she had done her duty. But the real shock was still to come, a shock that would reveal not the man's actions but her own. The phone pressed against Karen's ear felt heavy, yet her voice came out sharp and quick. She spoke in short bursts, each word colored not by truth but by the assumption she had already convinced herself of. "Yes, hello, I need to report something suspicious," she began, her tone urgent, almost dramatic. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Ma'am, what's happening?" Karen glanced back at the cream-colored house, where the man was still crouched by the wires, his small toolbox open beside him. "There's a man outside," she said firmly. "He's messing with cables like he's trying to tamper with something. I don't think he lives here. It looks wrong. You need to send someone quickly." She left out the most important truth, that it was his house. That she had seen him come and go countless times. That he had never once caused trouble in the neighborhood. Instead, she painted him as an outsider, as a threat. The more she spoke, the more convinced she became of her own story. "Can you describe him?" the dispatcher asked. Karen's voice dropped slightly, but her words carried weight. She described his skin color first, before anything else. She mentioned his clothing, his posture, the way he was working with wires. Each detail stacked like bricks, building a picture of suspicion where none truly existed. The dispatcher took notes, repeating back information carefully. "You're saying he's outside the house right now?" "Yes," Karen replied quickly. "He's still there. He's crouching by the wires, touching the connections. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't look good. Please send someone before it's too late." Her words carried urgency, but it wasn't the urgency of real danger. It was the urgency of fear twisted by prejudice, a fear that blinded her from the ordinary truth. The man was just fixing his Wi-Fi, nothing more. The dispatcher reassured her that officers would be sent. Karen ended the call and lowered the phone, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear but with a strange sense of importance. She believed she had done her duty as a good neighbor. She told herself she had prevented a crime, though no crime had been committed. Across the street, the man wiped his hands on a cloth, sighing in relief as the Wi-Fi signal on his phone finally showed full strength. He smiled faintly, satisfied with his small victory. To him, the evening's task was over. He began packing his tools back into the box, humming quietly to himself. The night felt ordinary, calm, even peaceful. But down the road, the hum of engines was beginning. The dispatcher had sent a patrol car immediately, followed by another for backup. To them this was just routine, another call, another report of a suspicious person. They had no idea that what awaited them was not a crime in progress, but the simple act of a man fixing his own internet. Inside her house, Karen paced near the window, pulling the curtain aside again and again. Her heart beat quickly, not because she was afraid, but because she was eager. She wanted to see the flashing lights, the arrival of officers who would validate her fears. She wanted to be proven right in front of the neighborhood, to show that her watchfulness was not in vain. When the first faint glow of headlights appeared at the end of the street, she gasped softly, almost with excitement. "Finally," she whispered. She imagined the officers stepping out, questioning the man, maybe even handcuffing him if they found something wrong. The scene played out in her mind like a movie, one where she was the unseen hero who had called for help. The sound of sirens grew closer, though they were soft, not blaring. The officers did not want to alarm the area unnecessarily. But to the man crouched by his house, the sudden flash of red and blue lights across the walls was startling. He looked up, confused, blinking against the glow. His hands froze above his toolbox. His mind raced. What could possibly be happening? Neighbors stirred at the noise. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open slightly. People peeked out, curious about the commotion. Whispers began to spread. What's going on? Why are the police here? In just a few seconds, the quiet street had turned into a stage with the man at the center. Karen stood tall by her window, satisfaction flooding her chest. This was the moment she had waited for. She believed she had been proven right. But the truth was about to unfold, a truth that would not only shake her but also shame her. The officers stepped out of their cars, their flashlights cutting through the night. They moved toward the man cautiously, their expressions serious. One of them called out firmly, "Sir, can you step away from the wires?" The man blinked, startled, his heart pounding. He slowly stood, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "Officers? What's wrong? This is my house. I'm just fixing my Wi-Fi." The tension thickened. Karen watched eagerly, waiting for the officers to uncover what she imagined was a crime. But what they would uncover instead was something she could never have expected. A truth so ordinary, so simple, that it would leave her exposed, embarrassed, and speechless. The faint hum of engines grew louder, and then the quiet street was suddenly awash in flashing red and blue lights. They bounced off windows, spilled across lawns, and painted the cream-colored house in streaks of color. The silence of the night cracked open as two squad cars rolled slowly to a stop. Their headlights glared against the pavement, making the scene look far more dramatic than it truly was. The man looked up, startled, his hand still resting on his toolbox. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. Police cars? Here. For him? He wasn't doing anything wrong. Just moments ago, he had been humming quietly to himself, satisfied at fixing his Wi-Fi. Now, his heart thudded in his chest, sharp and uneven. The doors of the squad cars opened, and two officers stepped out, followed by another pair from the second car. Their faces were serious, their flashlights already drawn, beams cutting through the night as they moved toward him. One of them spoke firmly, the kind of tone used to control a situation before it escalates. "Sir, step away from the wires," the officer called out. The man froze. His eyes darted from one officer to the other, his breath catching in his throat. His instincts told him to stay calm, to avoid sudden movements. He lifted his hands slightly, palms open, a universal sign of peace. His voice came out steady though his chest felt tight. "Officers," he said carefully, "this is my house. I'm just fixing my Wi-Fi. There's no problem here." But the officers didn't relax immediately. They had received a call, after all, a suspicious person tampering with lines. Procedure demanded they verify. One of them moved closer, his flashlight sweeping across the man's face, his tools, the router wires. Another officer circled slightly, scanning the house as though expecting signs of a break-in. Inside his chest, the man's heart hammered harder. His mind raced through possibilities. What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm lying? He had read enough stories, seen enough videos, to know how quickly misunderstandings could spiral. Across the street, Karen watched from behind her curtain, her eyes wide with self-satisfaction. To her, the scene unfolding felt like confirmation. The flashing lights, the officer's cautious approach. It was everything she had expected. She whispered to herself almost smugly, "I knew it. I knew something was wrong." She didn't know that the truth was about to betray her completely. Neighbors began peeking out now, drawn by the lights. A door cracked open 2 houses down, a woman clutching her robe as she stepped onto her porch. A young man leaned out of an upstairs window, squinting at the scene below. Whispers floated through the street. What's going on? Who are they talking to? Is he in trouble? The man swallowed hard, feeling the weight of all those unseen eyes on him. His hands remained raised slightly, his toolbox still open at his feet. He spoke again, his voice calm but urgent. Please, officers. This is my property. I live here. I'm not doing anything wrong. I was just fixing the internet connection. You can check my ID, the bills, anything. One officer exchanged a glance with his partner. His tone softened, but his professionalism remained. All right, sir. We'll need to confirm that. Can we see some identification? Slowly, carefully, the man nodded. Of course, he said. He reached into his back pocket, moving slowly so they wouldn't mistake his action. He pulled out his wallet, opened it, and handed over his driver's license. His heart still pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. The officer took the ID, shining his flashlight over it. He read the name, the address. He looked back at the house, then back at the man. Everything matched. The man's shoulders relaxed slightly, but he stayed silent, waiting for their response. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued to watch, the scene growing heavier with each second. The red and blue lights reflected in their eyes, their thoughts turning from curiosity to unease. Some of them began to wonder, had there really been a crime? Or was this something else entirely? Karen, however, clung to her certainty. She leaned closer to the window, eager to see the officers confront him further. She wanted validation, proof that her call had been right. She didn't realize that each second brought her closer to the moment her mistake would be exposed. The officer handed the ID back to the man, his voice steady but noticeably different from before. This is your house, sir? Yes, the man said firmly. My house. My equipment. I work in tech. I know what I'm doing. My Wi-Fi was down, so I stepped outside to fix the connection. That's all. The officers fell silent for a moment. The night air buzzed with tension. And then, slowly, the realization began to set in. The call had been exaggerated. There was no crime, no danger, no reason for suspicion. Just a man in his own yard, fixing something every homeowner has fixed at one point or another. The man lowered his hands carefully, his chest still tight, but a spark of relief passing through him. The flashing lights still painted the street, but the truth was beginning to cut through. The police had arrived ready for confrontation. Instead, they had found nothing but a neighbor's prejudice wrapped in false alarm. And though the officers remained professional, the shift in their expressions was clear. They knew they had been misled. The real question now was not about the man by the wires, but about the person who had made the call that brought them here. The flashing lights still painted the houses in streaks of red and blue, but the tension had shifted. At first, it was the man who felt the weight of suspicion pressing on his shoulders. Now, as the officer stood with his ID in hand, checking the address against the home behind him, the pressure slowly began to slide in another direction. The lead officer cleared his throat, his tone more measured now. All right, sir. Just walk me through exactly what you were doing tonight. The man nodded, his voice calm but edged with the stress of the moment. I was fixing my Wi-Fi. The connection's been cutting out all week. I've got the router inside, but the cables run along this side of the house. I just tightened them up, reset the system, and checked the signal on my phone. He lifted the phone slightly, showing the glowing screen as proof. Another officer crouched down, glancing at the tools in the open box. Small pliers, cable ties, a screwdriver. Nothing suspicious, nothing criminal. Just the ordinary tools of a homeowner solving an ordinary problem. The first officer nodded slowly. Okay. Do you have proof this is your property? The man sighed, reaching into his wallet again. Yes. My driver's license has the address. And if you want, I can get my utility bill inside. It's all in my name. This is my house. The officers exchanged glances. One gave a small nod. The story made sense. The ID matched. The tools matched. Everything pointed to the truth he had been saying from the start. He wasn't trespassing, he wasn't tampering, he wasn't stealing. He was just at home, fixing his own internet. Still, the process required formality. One officer asked, "Did anyone approach you tonight? Anyone speak to you before we got here?" The man shook his head. No. I was out here by myself. I didn't even notice anyone watching. His voice carried a mix of exhaustion and quiet frustration. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was the one being questioned under flashing lights while neighbors whispered behind closed curtains. And those neighbors were whispering. Doors had opened, faces peered out, the glow of phone screens flickered as some filmed discreetly from their windows. The neighborhood was watching every second, their judgment no longer aimed at the man, but drifting toward the unseen caller who had sparked all of this. Karen, standing behind her curtain, felt a twist in her stomach. She had expected the officers to act differently. She had expected them to confirm her suspicions quickly, to thank her for her vigilance, to treat the man as though he didn't belong. But now, listening to the tone of the officers, she sensed the shift. They weren't treating him like a criminal anymore. They were treating him like a resident, a homeowner, someone who was exactly where he should be. The lead officer's radio crackled softly as he confirmed the details with dispatch. The response came back. The name and address matched perfectly. The account on file for internet service was in his name. Everything aligned. There was no mistake on his part. The officer turned back to the man, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "All right, sir. Everything checks out. Seems like this was just a misunderstanding. We received a call about a suspicious person. That's why we're here." The man tilted his head slightly, confusion flashing in his eyes. "A call? From who?" The officer hesitated, then said carefully, "From a neighbor." The words hung in the air like a weight. The man didn't need to ask which neighbor. He had seen the way Karen's curtains always twitched when he came outside, how her gaze lingered longer than the others. He knew. And though the officer didn't point to her house, the truth felt obvious. The man let out a slow breath, his shoulders heavy. "So someone thought I was suspicious," he said softly, almost to himself, "for working on my own house." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. He didn't respond. What could he say? They had come because of the call, but the call had been wrong from the start. The questioning continued briefly, his workplace, his schedule, whether he had experienced problems before. Each answer was steady, clear, leaving no room for doubt. With every word he spoke, the gap between the truth and the false suspicion widened. And with every nod from the officers, Karen's mistake grew louder in the silence. Finally, the lead officer closed his notebook. "Thank you for cooperating, sir. We appreciate your calmness. We'll make a note that this was a false alarm." The man nodded slowly. "I just don't understand why I had to prove I belong in my own yard." His voice wasn't angry. It was tired, heavy, carrying years of knowing that this wasn't just one night, but a pattern too many people like him had faced. The officers had no answer for that. They exchanged quiet looks, their professionalism hiding the discomfort of knowing the truth. They had been called here not because of danger, but because of prejudice. The questioning was over. The man was cleared. But the echo of the moment remained, filling the street with an uneasy awareness. Neighbors who had once piqued with curiosity now whispered with guilt, realizing how quickly suspicion had become a weapon. And in one house across the street, Karen stood stiffly, her face pale, her certainty crumbling as she realized the truth she had refused to see. The man bent down, slowly, carefully, and closed his toolbox. His hands moved with quiet dignity. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he didn't demand an apology. He only stood tall, holding his ID once more, a silent reminder to everyone watching. He had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. The questioning had ended. But the real answers had only just begun. The night air hung heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The officers stood quietly, their flashlights now lowered, their voices calmer than when they had first arrived. The man, still standing near his toolbox, felt the sting of what had just happened settling deep in his chest. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, under questioning, under suspicion, simply because someone had decided to see danger where there was none. The lead officer finally spoke again, his voice carrying both professionalism and something softer, almost like regret. "Sir, everything checks out. Your ID matches this address. Dispatch confirmed your internet account is registered here. And your tools? Well, they're the same any technician or homeowner would use. You're not in the wrong. This was a false report." The words landed with weight, not just for the man but for the neighbors who were still peeking through windows and standing silently on porches. A few whispered quietly, their tones carrying guilt. They had doubted him too, if only in their silence. They had expected trouble the moment the police lights flashed down the street. And now, realizing the truth, they shifted uncomfortably in their places. The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing but his dignity still bruised. "So let me get this straight," he said softly, his voice calm but cutting. "Someone saw me fixing my own Wi-Fi, at my own house, and thought it was a crime worth calling the police for?" The officers exchanged glances, their silence answering the question more clearly than words ever could. One of them cleared his throat. "Yes. We were told there was a suspicious person tampering with wires. We have to respond to calls like that. But it's clear now, You weren't doing anything wrong. The man nodded slowly, pressing his lips together. His eyes moved across the street, to the dark window where Karen stood hidden behind her curtain. He couldn't see her face, but he didn't need to. He had felt her eyes before. He knew. And in that moment, the truth was no longer just about his innocence. It was about the prejudice that had sparked this entire ordeal. The officers, sensing the tension, shifted their focus slightly. One of them turned toward Karen's house, the beam of his flashlight brushing briefly across the windows. He didn't call her out directly, but the gesture was enough. Everyone who had been watching understood what it meant. The false suspicion hadn't come from the man at the wires. It had come from the shadows of another house. Inside, Karen's heart pounded against her ribs. She stepped back from the window, her breath quick and shallow. She had wanted to be the hero of the night, the one who kept the neighborhood safe. But now the truth stood bare. She was the cause of the humiliation, the reason a neighbor had been treated like a criminal on his own property. The power she had felt when dialing 911 drained away, replaced by the cold weight of shame. The officers continued their checks, not because they doubted the man anymore, but because they wanted to close the matter officially. One officer radioed in, confirming to dispatch, "False alarm. Resident at the address was working on personal equipment. No violation, no crime." The crackle of the radio carried across the street, and though the words were routine, they sounded like a verdict. The neighborhood absorbed it in silence. A few neighbors stepped further onto their porches, some shaking their heads, others lowering their gazes. They realized now how fragile dignity could be when suspicion was allowed to rule. They had witnessed a man's peace shattered, not by his actions but by someone else's fear. The man bent down and began gathering his tools again. Each movement was careful, deliberate. He wasn't rushing, but there was a heaviness in the way he closed the box, as though he was carrying more than just pliers and wires. He was carrying the weight of yet another reminder that his skin color, his presence, his ordinary actions could be twisted into suspicion at any moment. The officers lingered for a moment longer. One of them, clearly uncomfortable, spoke gently. "Thank you for cooperating, sir. We know this wasn't fair to you. Sometimes people call things in without the full picture." The man looked at him, his expression steady, his voice low but sharp. "Without the full picture? Or with the picture they wanted to see?" The officer said nothing. There was no defense for it. He gave a small nod, almost like an acknowledgement, before stepping back toward his car. The red and blue lights still flashed against the walls, but they no longer looked like symbols of safety. They looked like reminders of how quickly assumption could turn ordinary life into spectacle. The truth had been uncovered. The man was innocent, the call was false, but the damage had been done. The neighborhood would remember this. They would remember the sight of him standing in his yard, hands raised, trying to prove he belonged in his own home. They would remember the officers confirming what should never have been questioned. And though no names were spoken, they would remember which house had made the call. Karen sat in the dark of her living room, her curtain now fully closed. Shame pressed down on her, heavier than the pride she had felt earlier. She told herself she had only been cautious, that she had only wanted to protect the neighborhood. But deep down she knew. Her caution had not come from care. It had come from prejudice. And the truth, now uncovered, left her exposed in a way no one would forget. The man picked up his toolbox at last, standing tall. He gave a short nod to the officers, then turned toward his front door. His steps were steady, each one carrying both exhaustion and quiet dignity. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to accuse. The truth had spoken louder than anything he could have said. And as the officers returned to their cars, shutting off the flashing lights, the street fell into darkness again. But the lesson lingered in the air, clear and sharp. It had not been the man who was suspicious. It had been the assumptions of those who looked at him and saw danger where there was none. The night settled back into quiet after the police cars pulled away, their engines fading into the distance. The red and blue lights no longer washed over the houses, but the memory of them lingered like a stain on the street. The silence felt different now, not peaceful but heavy, as though every window, every porch, and every neighbor carried the weight of what had just happened. The man stood for a moment in front of his house, his toolbox in one hand, his other hand resting against the railing of his porch. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had just been forced to defend the obvious truth, that he belonged in his own home. The neighbors who had been peeking from behind curtains now pulled back quickly, ashamed to be caught staring. Some whispered softly to family members, others simply shook their heads. Across the street, Karen sat in her darkened living room, her heart pounding as she replayed the scene in her mind. She had imagined herself the watchful protector of the neighborhood, the one who had acted when others might have ignored. Instead, she had become the source of humiliation, not for him. He had walked away with dignity, but for herself. She had revealed her prejudice, her fear, her eagerness to assume the worst. And though no one had named her aloud, everyone knew. The shame sat heavy on her chest, pressing until she could barely breathe. The man finally turned and walked inside, the door closing softly behind him. Inside, the air felt both familiar and strange. His living room, his chair, his cooling mug of tea, all of it the same, yet somehow changed by what had happened outside. He set his toolbox down, sank into his chair, and stared at the Wi-Fi signal now glowing full on his phone. The irony of it stung. He had fixed his internet, but in doing so, he had been treated like a criminal. He thought of the questions the officers had asked, of the way the neighbors had watched, of the fear that had flickered in his own chest when the flashing lights first appeared. He had done nothing wrong, but still he had been forced to prove his innocence. That truth gnawed at him, not just as one night's ordeal, but as a reminder of how fragile dignity could feel when viewed through the lens of prejudice. Meanwhile, in the houses nearby, the whispers continued. Families talked in low voices, some in anger, some in regret. Why would anyone call the police on him? One neighbor asked quietly. Another shook their head, saying, I've seen him every day. He's lived here for years. He never caused any trouble. The realization spread like a ripple through the street. The problem had not been the man, it had been the assumptions made about him. Karen sat frozen, her phone still on the table where she had left it after dialing. The same phone she had used so confidently now seemed like evidence of her mistake. She wanted to believe she had only been cautious, that she had only been trying to protect her neighborhood. But the truth would not let her hide. She had not been cautious. She had been careless with her judgment. And the whole neighborhood had seen the result. She imagined what the whispers would be tomorrow, how her neighbors would look at her, how they might avoid her with cold politeness. The power she thought she held over her street was gone, replaced by a shadow of shame she could not shake. For the man, though, the aftermath was different. He did not storm across the street demanding an apology. He did not shout at his neighbors or curse the unfairness of it all. Instead, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity he had shown from the start. He knew the truth spoke louder than anger ever could. His calmness, his grace under suspicion, that would stay with the people far longer than words. And it did. The neighbors remembered. They remembered the sight of him standing calmly, his ID in his hand, his voice steady as he explained himself. They remembered the officers admitting it had all been a mistake. They remembered how their own hearts had sunk when they realized they had doubted him too, even if only silently. The lesson spread through the street like an invisible current. Never assume, never judge, never let prejudice guide your eyes. As the night grew deeper and the last lights in the houses clicked off, the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet. But the quiet was different now. It was not the ordinary peace of a suburban street. It was the silence of reflection, of unease, of change. For Karen, that silence was filled with shame. For the neighbors, it was filled with questions about themselves. And for the man, it was filled with resilience, the kind that comes from surviving yet another moment of being unfairly judged, and walking away taller than those who judged him. The story of the night would live on in whispers and retellings, a warning about how quickly prejudice can turn into humiliation, not for its target but for the one who carries it. And though the Wi-Fi worked perfectly again, the true signal left behind was far stronger. The signal that dignity cannot be erased and truth will always uncover what lies beneath suspicion.